Alldus podcast is brought to you by Alldus International, supplying your expert AI and digital transformation staffing needs across the US and Europe. Today, you are listening to our AI in Action series, where leading minds in AI from across the world share their story, success, and advice. AI in Action cuts through the hype and explores the true impact of artificial intelligence in our world today.
You're listening to AI in Action. I'm your host, JP Valentine. Our guest today is Jason King. Jason is the Director of Data Science at XSOLIS. Jason, welcome to the show.
Happy to be here. Thank you, JP.
Oh, it's our pleasure. We appreciate it. So, Jason, let's start with yourself. Can you give us a brief overview of your background, where you first got started in technology, and sort of walk us through some of the roles you've held along the way, taking us up to just before you joined XSOLIS?
At heart, I'm a physicist. I guess you could say my journey in tech started undergrad. I just picked the hardest thing I could think of, and at the time that was a physics degree at UT Knoxville. And I figured, it's sort of funny to think about it now, but I had always thought, hey, I can just switch to engineering, which is probably not, if this is too hard, but probably would have been a lot more difficult actually in retrospect. So I actually got my PhD in physics from the University of Tennesse Space Institute. That's like a graduate-only research facility in Tullahoma, Tennessee, which is it is part of the UT Knoxville campus. It's very closely associated, but it's a satellite facility and it's graduate only. And I kind of stumbled into it. I knew I wanted to do something in applied physics. And at the time, I had gone out to a number of different graduate facilities, and I was most attracted to UTSI because they were interested in doing an RA immediately. So no 1 year TA or anything. And I was day one in the lab doing a lot of confocal microscopy. And eventually I was working on single molecule trapping. So specifically around a technique called the anti-Brownian electrokinetic trap, which is a way to study single fluorescent molecules in solution. And it really involves a lot of high-speed control theory and image recognition and just a multitude of different things across data that actually come in pretty handy today. After I finished up graduate school, I had a little bit of a break. I knew that I wanted to get to NIST, so I had actually put in an application for an NRC postdoc. But in the intermediate period, I worked in a small firm that did aerospace. And there I was a research scientist where I just took on a couple of different projects where I was just trying to solve some, we'll say, esoteric problems. Things like butt welding on exotic plastics and that sort of stuff. I actually did get a National Research Council fellowship to work at NIST, the Gaithersburg campus. And for those of you who may not know, that's the National Institute of Standards and Technology. And that was really an extension of the work I had done for my PhD, where I was taking those techniques and I was applying them to protein therapeutics. So the idea would be to study the process of aggregation in drugs like Humira or other monoclonal antibody formulations, and really understand what conditions lead to their growth or their creation. And at that point, I was having some difficulties in that research, but I was taking on a lot more data processing for my group. So it turns out that I was spending a lot of my time doing image analysis, looking at those protein aggregates in solution, but also doing what you might call like orthogonal approaches for metrology. So, it's kind of tricky because a lot of the stuff we were looking at was sort of at the diffraction limit. and has a very similar or extremely hydrated. So a lot of the stuff you're trying to look at is very difficult to see, even with some techniques like phase microscopy. So as a result, we would often try 2 or 3 different measurement techniques and cross-reference the results. So I got really focused on Brownian motion and image detection or object detection through automated image analysis. And by measuring, like, say, just the vibration of these particles in solution, you can get an idea what their hydrodynamic radius is. So we had a lot of success there. I did a very brief postdoc at the University of Maryland while I continued at the end of my NRC postdoc. And at that point, my wife was really interested in moving back to Nashville. So I started hunting around for something in sort of connected to, my background, but also maybe just in the realm of data. And that's when I started to stumble into data science, particularly data science in respect to healthcare. So after a lot of self-study and a huge amount of cold calling and applications, I came on to XSOLIS in 2016.
Excellent. Jason, thank you for the overview, and I appreciate the level of detail you've gone into, because I think it's important for people who are listening that are coming from the non-traditional backgrounds of computer science that to hear somebody who's come in the science route and now landed where you're at. It's often helpful to understand the rationale and the steps and the decision making behind it. So talk to us about XSOLIS. At a high level, who are XSOLIS? What are you doing specifically within healthcare? And then give us some insight into your role leading things in the data team.
Sure. So at its heart, XSOLIS is a workflow management company for utilization review. And in case you've never heard of it, utilization review is a department in the hospital that is staffed by experienced clinical subject matter experts, so really nurses, right? And what they're doing is fulfilling, I would say, like a compliance role, but really they're trying to streamline the process of care. And the whole idea here is that they're not always interacting with the patient, but they are monitoring all active encounters, and they're making sure that people are getting things like pre-authorization. They're being treated or they're receiving the correct level of care. And by that I mean, should they be admitted? Is it appropriate for them to have been admitted into the hospital as an inpatient? And also ensuring that they're being discharged in a timely manner. So in a way, it's sort of the first line of defense in preventing denial events. And by that I mean where obviously the provider submits a claim to the payer and then they deny it based on the need for medical care. So at XSOLIS, we pretty much we're a SaaS tool, and we provide an interface for those utilization review nurses to do their job more efficiently. And we're not automating decision making or anything like that. We're just I'd say the 0th level sort of interface is just making all the information that's relevant to those UR nurses easily obtainable. So this is things like, they may have access to the EMR, but they have now a dashboard that sort of consolidates all of the necessary information. And then beyond that, the value we provide is really to give them some augmentation to their workflow. So you might imagine at any given time, the UR nurse has to review 100 active encounters. And it's been pretty low tech up until, XSOLIS. For the most part, you would get that sheet, you might print it off, and then you would just go through all 100 patients just every day, right? You might have some heuristics to sort of order things, maybe based off of current length of stay or something, but in general, it was very ad hoc, and it was hospital to hospital, right? So what we do is we try to, we have a number of different models that address different field or different aspects of the case. I'd say we really concentrate on 3 different domains. ingress, patient stratification, and egress. So by ingress, as I had mentioned earlier, there's always a question of whether or not to admit someone. And the truth is there that it's not always clear, and there can be a huge, financial difference for a patient that is actually in the same bed, but is maybe outpatient or inpatient, right? The tricky part about trying to predict if somebody should be an inpatient is that there is no clinical definition of what it means to be inpatient. It actually varies by the payer, and even, we'll say, the healthcare market. Now, it's pretty clear that if someone comes in and they're in a very bad state that they should be admitted, but it's sometimes a little unclear if you have, say, an outpatient surgery and there's some complication, whether or not you really should be admitted into the hospital, which is a strange concept because, again, you could be in a bed in the hospital and not be an inpatient. It really is a financial class distinction. So, the kind of models that we have are trying to target this state that is really somewhat subjective. And it's compounded in its difficulty because the different payers will have a different internal definition or threshold for that inpatient status. But of course, they're not going to share that with the provider. And even if they could, it's maybe not good to think about, what is the minimum threshold I need to get to have someone admitted, right? It really should focus more, in my opinion, on the outcome. So that's more on the ingress side. When we talk about patient stratification, it's really just about identifying the type of encounter. So there's a pretty common system, the MSDRG, which is the diagnostic related group. And if you're an inpatient and you're a Medicare patient, you are essentially grouped into different categories. That can affect the payout, but it also really kind of gives you the topic of an encounter, right? Like what happened? It might be something like pneumonia with major complications, or in some cases it might be live birth without complications, let's say, right? That information can drive a lot of different hospital processes. Maybe you want to improve your outcomes for a particular class of procedures or patients, but unfortunately that information about that DRG is typically not available during the encounter. So a lot of the time this comes after the fact, after you've done the coding and you're getting ready to submit the claim. So as much as possible, we're trying to predict that working DRG as early as possible. And I really should take a step back and say that, the kind of data we're working with at XSOLIS is pretty much anything that's available within the EMR. So we have real-time HL7 feeds set up between all of our provider clients and XSOLIS. And probably within about a minute or two of them entering information into the database or into their EMR, we're going to get a copy of it. And all of our models run in real time. They're universal models that work across all clients. And we're updating those predictions. Is somebody appropriate for inpatient? Are they a particular DRG? In real time while the case is active. That way that information can be actionable. And then the final set of models that we work on are really about egress, and it's anticipating discharge events. So there's a whole concept in the, we'll say, clinical financial space about avoidable days. And as an example, you might imagine that if you break your leg and you're in the hospital for 3 days, on the third day, you might, your physician or your attending physician might say, well, you're free to go in the morning following an x-ray, final exit x-ray. So morning comes and then you wait around all day for that final x-ray and you don't get to leave until 3 p.m. Well, it turns out that the payer considers it an avoidable day. Even though you were occupying that bed, even though you were not really discharged, there still incurs a cost, but the payer is often unwilling to pay for that because really that kind of was an administrative delay. So again, getting back to that whole augmented workflow or augmented workflow, if we can anticipate those discharge events earlier in the encounter, so I can maybe predict when I think someone's going to be medically ready to discharge, or when I think they're actually the attending physician is going to say, you release them. The UR nurse can basically look ahead and schedule that exit x-ray, right? So they can make sure that there's a slot in the morning and that they're not going to incur additional costs or be subject to that avoidable day scenario. I mean, and that extends beyond even just stuff like administrative delays, right? But you'd be surprised how often that comes up. So even things like, hey, you can't take care of yourself at home, so you need to go to a skilled nursing facility. Well, let's make sure you have a bed to actually be transferred to. Otherwise, you're going to be waiting at the hospital, taking up a bed, right?
Yeah, and for anyone who's listening who's been through the U.S. healthcare system, will hear this, and it will resonate. I know it does for me as somebody who had surgery in the past few years. The complexity in the allocation of spend is just mind-boggling. I want to get your take on that in a moment, but I want to focus now on your team, the current makeup, the growth of the team, and the growth of the company as a whole, because XSOLIS has been growing at a substantial rate even in the past few years. So you're in the center of it. Talk to us about your data science team. What's the makeup and what has the growth been like?
Yeah, so I have a team of 6 data scientists now, 2 senior data scientists, a junior data scientist, and 3 DS2s is what we'll say. And they have a good variety of backgrounds. You know, we've got some people from engineering, physics backgrounds. You know, maybe that's showing my bias a little bit, right? Although, you know, there's no hard requirement for someone to have a advanced degree really to work at XSOLIS. It really is like the proof of work, right? So as a team, we work it's interesting. It's kind of collaborative, but also very free form. So I try to advocate for a discovery-based development pipeline. So obviously we want to try to bring value to the company, but we have to recognize, and I often try to communicate this to our senior leadership, that we may take on projects that will not have a direct deliverable or get directly to the client. It's just going to improve all other data science offerings. And it might be something like, let's say some normalization project, right? Because again, we work with a huge variety of different hospitals, different EMRs. So, something as simple as normalizing medications. I think the FDA has got something like 150,000 active NDCs. Well, if I look at the unique codes that I've got across all facilities, I mean, it might be in the order of 2 to 3 million unique codes. So clearly there's some overlap, and it's a question of how to get that combined. And at the individual hospital level or to the individual UR nurse, I can always simply display what they send us, but that doesn't have, and it will be meaningful to them in the sort of information retrieval domain. But for our purposes, it becomes very difficult to use those medications. Because again, there's no common, we want to build global models, we want to build models that are generalizable. But of course, now we've got all these sort of custom paths, right? So that's sort of an example of a project that I might kick to one of my team members and really just let them go at it, right? Or we might have a code jam or do something like that to solve a common business problem. We do have specific products, and I had mentioned earlier, like the working DRG model. And in that case, I really do have like a product owner, right? So I've got one of my senior data scientists is my go-to, and she's always looking to improve that model, even outside of the domain of just having to update it when the actual targets change. But one of the challenges here is that everything we do is sort of experimental. It's not clear when we take up a project that we're actually going to be able to deliver a viable product. And for every prototype that we advance to, the senior leadership team, there are probably thousands of different models that we've discarded along the way. So with that in mind, as the team grows, as the company grows, as we expand into new domains, and we have more clients that are asking for specific functionality, I obviously need to grow the team. And some of the things that we're really looking for are people who can really take on more, I would say, full stack development in the context of data science, because a lot of what we do is, the truth is, a lot of what we do is a combination of data science and data engineering. It's not enough just to make a model, clearly. You have to deploy it, and you have to have it set up in a way that it is scalable and affordable. So everyone on my team currently does that, for their own models, and everyone is sort of cross-trained in that domain. It would be great to have somebody who has some better tooling practices. So as we grow, that's the kind of skill set I'm looking for.
Yeah, really helpful. And with the rate of growth that XSOLIS has seen, I'm sure there's going to be lots of opportunities for people to join. You mentioned the team doubling in size, so great time for people interested in this space to get involved. I want to move on then. Final question from me is, for people interested in this space, what advice would you offer to them to sort of transition from a different industry or develop a skill set that's going to help them at interview stage when applying to get into healthcare?
Yeah, that's a really good question. When I think back to some of the people that I hired and some of the better interviews that I've had, the common thread there, I'd say, is probably a passion in the projects that you take on. So, I did transition from, we'll say, an academic environment, and I didn't have any experience in software development or data science in industry. And I think what really worked well for me was to pick up some projects that I cared about. In my case, I was able to help some coworkers at NIST, but some of the best people that I've hired have had some really interesting projects that I've had the fortune to sit through presentations or demonstration or demo days or those sort of things, and that passion really carries through, right? The truth is that there may be some, we'll say, more marketable projects, but I really don't want to see the same data sets, the same targets. I'd rather see something that is clearly interesting to the person that put it together.
Yeah, and I think that's a great way to sort of shortcut lack of commercial experience and offset it with interest, because in interview people are going to look at the body of work in its entirety, and a GitHub account with some really interesting projects can go a long way to offset lack of hands-on commercial experience. So I'm glad you highlight that. Jason, I appreciate you coming on and talking to us. It's been a pleasure learning about your background, quite an interesting journey. Clearly, the space you're operating now with XSOLIS is one where there's a lot of impact to be had, and anyone who's involved can really see the impact for patient care and improvements. And it's exciting times. There's a lot of growth at XSOLIS, so happy to have you on and talk to us about that. We wish you and your team all the best in the year ahead.
Well, thank you very much, JP. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Alldus Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any Android podcast of choice. You can also head over to our website, www.alldus.com, to listen to more podcasts, view our open roles, and stay up to date with industry news. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more great episodes coming very soon.